Hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Andre, and welcome to this online webinar entitled The Return of the King, What Does Brexit Mean for Britain? I'm very happy to moderate this online discussion for the Martens Centre. We'll run from 3 p.m. Brussels time and finish at 4 p.m. on the dot. I'm very happy to have two expert discussants to discuss the issues that have arisen over the past couple of months. Our first speaker is Professor Anand Menon, Professor of European Politics and Foreign Affairs at King's College, and also Director of UK in a Changing Europe, which has emerged as a key source of all Brexit-related information over the past couple of years. Our second speaker is Dr. Garvan Walsh. He is Executive Director of TRD Policy, and he is a former advisor on security matters for the British Conservative Party. He's also an author of the Martens Centre and publishes regularly in publications such as Foreign Affairs and Conservative Home. I'll leave plenty of time for online questions at the end. So we'll just have a discussion, maybe 35, 40 minutes. Please just get in contact on Facebook or Twitter to the Martens Centre, or you can tweet me directly on Twitter at Andre. Okay, just to provide a bit of context, Britain has officially left the European Union, but still the future relationship between the UK and EU dominates the space between Brussels and London. It's been complicated over the past 7 or 8 months by the coronavirus and the huge economic and social impacts that the virus is having. But in a sense, Britain has, in a lot of ways in Brussels, and quite unfortunately, in my view, I think, solely become viewed through the prism of Brexit. And in Brussels, then, that results in a slightly myopic or slightly blinker view of what's actually going on in British political affairs, and especially, the rationale and the underlying factors of what's happening, particularly in Westminster. So really, this discussion is really going to focus on British politics and how Brexit has affected British politics. And we're going to try and not get bogged down in the nitty-gritty of the Brexit negotiations. With that, I'm going to start with Professor Menon. It's not a popular view here in Brussels, but I'm going to ask you the question anyway. I think, would you agree that if we use the Brexit referendum result in 2016 as a starting point, that result in that referendum might actually have been a required reset for both Britain and British politics? By what I mean is that did the referendum result actually force Britain to focus on some of the key issues that might not have been considered otherwise? I'm talking about, very high levels of geographical inequality, higher than continental peers, levelling up, immigration, etc., etc. I'd just be interested for your thoughts on that.
I think my honest answer, and it's a bit of a wimpy answer, is yes and no. I'm not sure anyone expected or that Britain necessarily needed the brutality of the reset we've been through. So, it really has been a shock to the nature of our politics. On the other hand, yes, what the referendum clearly did was lay bare a number of things that, let's face it, we could and should have been aware of long beforehand. You talked about regional inequality, but no one had done anything about, and no one had done anything about largely because of the nature of our electoral system meant that absent something like a referendum, those issues would never, the people worried about those issues would never be able to muster enough votes between them to change the status quo. However, even though we're now talking about things we should have been talking about a long time before, we've got a Conservative government, for heaven's sake, that's talking about levelling up, that's talking about investment in the north. Despite all that, the biggest single impact on our politics, I think, of the referendum was the fact that effectively since June 2016, we've not been governed. Nothing has happened in our country apart from a debate about Brexit and now the pandemic. And, if you just look at how little governments have achieved since June 2016, one of the results of that is that those very problems that are now on the agenda have become worse rather than better in the intervening period.
Just a follow-up, you mentioned kind of this inertia since 2016. Do you think then that ultimately it's going to be these domestic kind of policy issues, be it inequalities, be it the lack of jobs, or be it maybe more importantly how the government is responding to the coronavirus, that it will be these domestic issues that largely determine the trajectory of British politics and not so much Brexit?
No, absolutely. But bear in mind that COVID changes everything, because the issue pre-pandemic wasn't the lack of jobs, it was the prevalence of low-paying jobs. I mean, one of the most startling things about the British economy pre-pandemic were the very high numbers of people in the United Kingdom who were living in poverty but were employed. Now we're going to face a completely different problem, which is skyrocketing unemployment. So the terms of the debate, I mean, this is one of the things about British politics at the moment, is I think the things that we are talking about now will not be the things we're talking about in January and February, because the debate is going to change fundamentally as the full economic impact of lockdown, of the end of the furlough scheme and so on become obvious. Then I think we're going to be talking about unemployment and the state of the economy to the exclusion of everything else.
And would it be fair to say that the longer the corona crisis continues, that the more the British public is losing faith in the current government, given the mixed messaging? I noted that the Financial Times said that the current government was sloganeering its way through the corona crisis. I was just wondering, is that going to be kind of like an ebb and flow as confidence slowly drips away?
Again, honestly, I don't know. It's certainly the case that this government has not only made substantive mistakes in its handling of the virus. I think locking down too late, stopping the track and trace process back in March, rather than investing heavily in it then, I think two obvious ones. But also, yes, you're right, the messages have been mixed. People people no longer know what the rules are in their area because we have these local lockdowns all over the place. If the government keeps on like this, then yes, I think it is pretty much inevitable that they will find that faith in the government will fall. That being said, the Labour Party hasn't established a commanding lead over the government as yet, which some people might find surprising, and so there's still all to play for. I think one of the reasons why the government has been so cautious about lockdown, so cautious about telling people not to go back to work, is because they recognise all too well that the main battle about COVID is yet to come. And that's going to be the battle of the economic consequences, how big those consequences are, what the implications are for the national economy, and ultimately, of course, who pays for it all.
Thank you. Dr. Walsh, just coming to you. We've got a Conservative government with what should be a very safe majority of 75, 80 seats, only elected in December 2019. But I'm just wondering, where does Prime Minister Johnson and the Conservative Party go now? Will MPs rally behind the Prime Minister in the event of a deal or no deal? Or has this kind of drip of confidence that seems to be ebbing away due to coronavirus, could that present a much more serious threat to the Prime Minister's position, say, in 2021?
Well, we're about to see something very strange this evening, which is former Prime Minister Theresa May voting against a 3-line whip on the internal market bill. This, I don't think, has happened since there really were 3-line whips and prime ministers in the modern sense of the word. It's a really, really bizarre situation. We'll also have to see how many people she carries with her. The rebellion had the sting taken out of it last week after a rather odd amendment by Bob Neill that didn't really address the fundamental problems with the legislation, but sort of calmed the politics down. But clearly, Theresa May is made of tougher stuff and is willing to continue this. I wonder who she'll have with her. She'll certainly give strength as well to Tory peers in the House of Lords, people like Michael Howard or Lord Lamont, who are also very much set against this. And they're against not only the details of the bill, but they're quite perturbed by the style of the Johnson administration, which, the people like Theresa May and Michael Howard are not on the liberal fringe of the Conservative Party. They are authoritarian, pro-executive Conservative leaders. But this has gone on even too far for them. And I think they're worried about the slapdash nature of everything this government seems to be doing, of which COVID policies are something, but they seem to be unable to stick to a course. They seem to be unable to think policies through, and also unable to do things that actually work. It's a staggering lack of forethought, and I suspect it's got something to do with them being obsessed with a very combative media culture. They're mostly journalists by training on the top team. They're people like Dominic Cummings like having fights even when there's nobody else around. He'd go to another planet just to start a fight with Elon Musk on Mars. But they don't realize that devoting all this energy to winning the headlines the next day in certain media outlets means you don't actually spend any time getting things to work effectively. And in government, getting things to work effectively matters, as we're seeing with COVID, as we're seeing with the withdrawal bill. And without getting into too many technicalities, the surprise there is not that the UK might want to wriggle out of the withdrawal agreement. The surprise was that they'd say so openly, rather than engage in the dispute resolution procedure, drag things out long enough, and leave the fines that would eventually ensue from this very slow process to be paid by the next government and not their own. It's a bit boggling that they seem to want to take everything by frontal assault, and this is causing a lot of concern in the Tory party, both among traditional, rebels, if you like, on the left of the party from the One Nation group, on the right of the party from the ERG. Steve Baker was starting to sound very worried about some of the coronavirus restrictions and regulations, which he thinks should be debated by Parliament, but the government just keeps ramming through using emergency procedures. There is not going to be a vote on that, I think, this week, but there will be other opportunities for dissent to be expressed. And it's surprising to see a party leader who's won a majority of 80, which is very big in British terms, coming into so much trouble so quickly. A lot of it's down to poor administration, but also poor parliamentary management. There seem to be a lot of people whose noses have been put out of joint, and he's finding difficulty dealing with that kind of thing. Now, I would say he's probably safe until after the mayoral and local and Scottish elections next May. There's very unlikely to be any serious move against him until then, despite the fabled ruthlessness of the Tory party. But after that, particularly with the Scottish National Party likely to use what will probably be a victory in those elections as a mandate for another independence referendum, then he could come under significant pressure.
And do you think, Arvin, just from a Brussels perspective, we're trying to explain this, or attempting to explain the new British landscape, where you have a Tory party, advocating for greater state involvement in industry, particularly high-tech industry, and you have a Labour Party that, is going to be very boring talking about fiscal responsibility. I'm just wondering, do we now have a new Conservative Party, or is this just the version of the Conservative Party that Boris Johnson is using in the short term to get what he wants? Or is there something a little bit more fundamental within the party?
Well, for your Irish audience, I'd say the Tory party fluctuates between whether it's Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael, and now it's in a Fianna Fáil moment. With another analogy with Italy, which is essentially the Italian Christian Democrats are in charge in the UK. They're highly pragmatic. They win seats in some of the more deprived parts of the country because of the division of the opposition. And they have a problem, which is they have to somehow reconcile their upper middle class, free market leaning traditional base with a rural or deprived no longer industrial in the case of the UK, formerly never industrial in the case of Italy, region that they have to funnel cash to. And in a literal sense, the cash is available because London is wealthy, just like the north of Italy is wealthy, and they can find ways to borrow money on the future taxes London will pay and send that money up north through various different kinds of projects. The Brexit exacerbates this because it destroys the industrial activity that actually is still going on up there. They have to find other ways of reviving the economies of Middlesbrough and Sunderland and Liverpool. It's not clear what those will be. The record in Italy of trying to do this through state-led Grand Projet has failed. You'll probably still see, like in Italy, you will see continuing move of the ambitious population away from Huddersfield and Dewsbury and towards London, because that's where the good jobs are, that's where the interesting work is, and that's where the money is. Just as lots of southern Italians throughout the 20th century moved up north, or lots of Spaniards moved from Andalusia to Barcelona. All these things will occur because they don't have a clear policy or a clear strategy for how to revive this activity. It's very rare to see such strategies actually working effectively without some internal natural form of economic growth. And what to do with these regions that became what they were because they were near coal and iron deposits at a time when coal and iron deposits are now irrelevant to economic activity is a large and open question. What to do with Katowice in Poland is an equally open question.
So it's
the Tory party is trapped in this sort of vice because it has to now have policies that will keep it in power by continuing to win support in the north. Now, that support was not so much bought by an increase in the share of the Tory vote, but rather more by a collapse in the Labour vote, because those people can bear to support Jeremy Corbyn. So Labour will now be much more competitive in those areas. Even more so, the pollster Peter Kellner suggested, than a uniform national swing model, which predicts a fairly close election. If Peter Kellner is right, you could even see Labour winning a lot of those seats back and putting the Tories in quite deep trouble. So it's going to be a difficult few years. At the moment, the Tories have tried to dial up the culture war to coalesce their base, but I'm not sure that's as effective against Keir Starmer as it was against Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah, thanks, Garvin. And that it brings us nicely to what I'd like to ask Professor Bennion, which is about the Labour Party. It's, I guess, from a Brussels perspective, Jeremy Corbyn's approach certainly took nearly as much of the blame for Brexit as did people like Boris Johnson and Michael Gove and such. So I was just wondering about, the strategy of the Labour Party now. We've got Keir Starmer, the new leader. He's clever, he's competent, he's very good in the Commons. As Garvin mentioned, the opinion polls have Labour back up to the low 40s. I'm just thinking, I think what's interesting about the new Labour approach is that Starmer was one of the very vocal advocates for a second referendum for several years. But since he became leader, he talks very little about Brexit. So I was just wondering, what do you think the Labour Party strategy will be in the next year or so as he tries to kind of reinforce his leadership or reinforce Labour as a credible alternative? Is it just to focus solely on domestic matters?
It's not necessarily to focus solely on domestic matters, though it will focus. I mean, everyone focuses on foreign policy. Isn't an electoral winning strategy in any country virtually, but certainly not the UK. Keir Starmer's strategy, I think, is quite clear. That is to hammer away at Boris Johnson at this question of competence. And what we don't know, we can guess, but what we don't know is whether competence becomes far, far more salient to the British public in the aftermath of COVID than it was beforehand. There are very good political scientists who are out there saying, if we have the economic crisis that economists are expecting, then absolutely, people aren't going to treat politics as some kind of pantomime anymore. They're going to want someone who can deliver, someone who looks like they know what they're doing. And I think that's what Keir Starmer is pinning his hopes on, is that the government continues to flail. And, just to echo what Garvan said, I think it's a very important point. This is a government that is better at campaigning than it is at governing. And that comes from, in the heart of number 10, the fact that vote leave people are now ensconced at the heart of government. Government requires a whole different set of skills, not least patience. And there's not a whole lot of that on display at the moment. So Keir Starmer has decided that if we can get them on competence, their inability to do the jobs they were elected to do, that's his best chance of overturning the Conservative majority. It's worth saying, I was struck by Garvan's tone about Conservative prospects. Keir Starmer has a mountain to climb to overcome an 80-seat majority in an era when Labour aren't winning seats in Scotland. It is very, very hard to see how Labour win a majority given the ascendancy of the SNP in Scotland. Now, of course, over the next 4 years, an awful lot of things can change, not least the position of the SNP, because we will have that debate about another independence referendum. But at the same time, the Scottish performance on COVID hasn't been fantastic. Scottish care homes are a massive concern. We don't know what happens to public opinion in Scotland. But Starmer will use competence and hope against hope that he could pull off what really would be a remarkable political feat if he enters 10 Downing Street in 2024.
And in that kind of push for competence, I guess Starmer will look to push Labour back to the centre in terms of, I'm just wondering, because it appears to me that Britain has become increasingly polarised. So I'm just wondering, where does Starmer go, or is there still a space, because we see Social Democrats throughout the European Union really, even, traditionally very strong parties like in Germany really struggling. And I'm just wondering, is that still a space that Labour could like to inhabit and still gain, an overall majority in the Commons?
Let's be clear firstly that the nature of Labour's pain is different to the nature of the SPD in Germany, not least as a function of our electoral system. We have an electoral system where you can get 40% of the vote and lose. All right, so it's a slightly different sort of problem. As to where Labour position themselves, and I'm increasingly unclear as to what the centre is anymore. In a period where you see the Conservative Party basically nationalising the economy, what is the centre? Mainstream economics in the UK now is a very long way to the left of where mainstream economics in the UK was under a Labour government. So I think the parties are quite close on economic policy, I think. It's hard to know what the economic policies of this government are yet. The interesting thing, I suppose, is the division over values. Garvan spoke about culture wars, and here Labour have an issue in the sense that their traditional approach and their traditional policies are a long way away from the voters they lost in those so-called red wall seats. But what Keir Starmer has done quite well, I think, is avoid talking about these issues when he could. He's been relatively quiet on things like Black Lives Matter, and very wisely not got involved in fights over values, which his predecessor would have thrown himself into with gay abandon. But equally, I think, signalled on a crucial issue that Labour is no longer Corbyn's Labour, and that's the issue of patriotism. One of the most sort of politically savvy things that Keir Starmer has done today is, on the anniversary of Victory in Europe Day, he had an op-ed in the Daily Telegraph talking, which is a Tory newspaper, straight down the line Conservative newspaper, Boris Johnson's old employer, in which he talked about patriotism. And that had a banner on the front page of the Daily Telegraph. And I think most people saw that and thought, wow, that's well done. So Labour are starting that fight back. But there is very little doubt, as Garvan says, that one of the things that Conservatives will do if they're struggling on competence and on the economy is to try and trigger some of those cultural issues, whether it's the BBC is one, for instance, Black Lives Matters is another one, woke universities, all the traditional themes of the cultural right, that it might well be that Keir Starmer faces more struggles to come if he's going to try and walk that tightrope, which allows him to avoid the battles he doesn't need to fight and make the statements that might appeal to traditional Labour voters.
And you think he's been successful in kind of stamping his authority on the party? He's not going to find a situation like Neil Kinnock did in the 80s, where there's elements of Corbynism that constantly seek to undermine his position or take the Labour Party on a slightly different tangent to the left. You think,
No, those elements will always be there in the same way that there'll be a one nation group inside the Conservative Party that doesn't like the direction of travel of the current government. I mean, because of our political system, our parties are broad tents. They have to be, because you have to get a large swathe of voters to support you. So, you will always have that internal bickering going on. Perhaps it's slightly disguised from view this year because we haven't had the party conferences. They're the times when you usually have the rogue fringe meeting where someone stands up and says something that everyone wishes they hadn't afterwards. So without that, I think it's easier to give the impression of unity because no one's paying any attention to the parties. But yeah, Keir Starmer has been very effective. He's proved himself ruthless in the sacking of Rebecca Long Bailey, for instance, and he's laid down the line. And to date, his shadow cabinet have stuck with him loyally.
Garvin, did you want to make a comment, or can I ask you? I'd like you to talk a bit more about Scotland, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, you might as well just ask me.
Okay.
Oh, well, the comment was relevant because it's Anand is absolutely right that if the SNP dominates Scotland, then Labour will find it very, very difficult to achieve an overall majority, and an overall majority for Labour probably is out of Starmer's reach. What is not out of Starmer's reach, however, is the ability to put together a majority with the Liberal Democrats in the South. Because under the British system, it really matters who's second in various different places. And across large areas of the Tory-supporting South, the Lib Dems are the second-place party. And a number of people will and have been in the past disillusioned with the Conservative Party and not willing to ever vote Labour, but could consider voting the Lib Dems, especially a Lib Dem party led by a relatively boring man like Ed Davey. So they've been sharp in picking the least interesting but also safest leader for them. So if, and this is always a big if because tribal instincts in Labour are very, very strong, if the Labour Party concentrate on sort of university towns where they just dominate urban areas and the north, and allow the Lib Dems to concentrate on suburban seats that are quite affluent, pro-European, but generally to the right on economic issues, and develop essentially an informal understanding of where to concentrate resources and an informal understanding about who anti-government voters should vote for, then they could just about manage to get enough seats between them to be able to deprive the Tories of the ability to form a government without having to rely on the SNP. I think that's the best Keir Starmer can do. Even that would be a very significant achievement to turn around a historic election lost for Labour, an 80-seat Tory majority after the Conservatives have been in power for 10 years. If he can do that, he will have proved himself to be a very successful politician, in a way repeating David Cameron's efforts in 2010. How he turned around two terrible elections for the Conservative Party, and one election that in historic terms was a very, very bad one, but just compared to 97 and 2001 was a relative improvement, leading to Gordon Brown having a majority about the same size as Boris Johnson's. This was in 2005. But Cameron managed to turn that majority into the Conservatives being the biggest party and being able to have a coalition with the Liberal Democrats. Starmer, in a sense, has the same scale of task ahead of him and might be able to do that if things roll well. But well, obviously that depends on what happens in Scotland. The SNP are mismanaging COVID, but I don't think they have to be mismanaged COVID. I don't have to manage COVID extremely competently. It's like the old story of the two runners running from a bear in the woods, and there's a pair of running shoes. One of them puts them on, legs it. The other one says, well, hold on a minute. You're not going to outrun the bear with those? He says, no, but I'll outrun you. The SNP only need to do better than at managing COVID than the government in London. They don't actually need to make a success of it in any objective terms. And so far, they're managing that, if only because they're communicating better than they are down in London. And that's enough for them to probably be successful in the elections in May. They're likely to win an overall majority. They will use that as an attempt to put Scottish independence back on the agenda. Boris Johnson will try and resist it. And there will be a constitutional battle over, first of all, over whether the Scottish government is entitled to hold a referendum. Is it like in Barcelona? Is it like in Catalonia, where a referendum would actually be illegal? Or is it just the case that they could hold a referendum, but it couldn't be binding on the government in London? Because that has to be done through national legislation, and only the Westminster Parliament can do that. And the devolution settlement forbids the Scottish Parliament from holding binding referendums on independence. Britain is not a confederal state where individual bits have a constitutional right to secede with the possible exception of Northern Ireland. But let's not go down that particular road right now. And the London government's in a bind, in a sense that if it rejects their desire for a referendum, then it will only strengthen a Scottish nationalist feeling and may radicalise it in some ways, possibly towards civil disobedience. If they accept it, they risk losing, because the opinion polls are now quite strongly in favour of Scottish independence.
Okay. And Garvin, do you think that, say the SNP wins an overall majority in the elections in May, that they proceed with, some sort of mechanism to move towards independence? Do you think that Prime Minister Johnson will, and this kind of new aspect of the Conservative Party, will actually fight to keep Scotland in the UK, even if it jeopardises their wider ambitions?
At the moment, they are determined to fight it. Boris Johnson sees that if he were to become the last Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, undoing an arrangement that's been established since 1707, he'd be in a very, very difficult spot and would probably have to resign. So he's very determined. But there's a growing element in the Conservative Party that has more of an English nationalist view and wants to say, well, if the Scots want to go and do their own thing, that's fine. We don't have to subsidise them anymore. Public finances will be even under more pressure after COVID. So let them go, let them be subsidised. Let's not pay for their socialism, I've heard one of them say to me. And so you might find a scope for compromise worked out there, maybe not with Boris Johnson, but perhaps with someone else, if there's enough internal dissent to remove him.
Okay. I just got a question in on my Twitter just for Professor Menyon. Please keep the questions coming to the Martens Centre on Twitter or Facebook. And it was just asking if you could explain to the Brussels audience why the Brexiteers, or why a huge portion of the Brexit media and British political discourse generally are so obsessed with what they term the special relationship with the United States. Certainly in Brussels, the Brexiteers certainly, waved a potential new US-UK trade deal as one of their big prizes from Brexit, which struck a lot of people in Brussels as very interesting, because many countries in Europe talk about their special relationship with the United States, the Poles, the French, the Irish. So I'm just wondering how did that come to form such a central part in the political narrative?
Well, there's a long history to that, clearly, which goes all the way back to the creation of the United States via 2 world wars. There's been a long history of collaboration, and in some areas, notably nuclear and intelligence cooperation, yes, there is a special relationship. I think the specific answer when it comes to Brexiters has been, I think, that in many cases they simply don't like the European Union and would use whatever arguments came to hand to try and justify their drive to leave it. I don't think there are many people in frontline politics who seriously believe that a trade deal with the United States will compensate for the trade impact of leaving the single market and the customs union. It simply won't. LSE did studies about this about 3 or 4 years ago, and I think the forecast was that if we signed a trade deal with the United States that removed every single tariff on trade between us and the US, it would be about 0.3% of GDP, the impact. Forecasts of the impact of the kind of deal that Boris Johnson is trying to get put the impact at about -6, -7% of GDP over 10, 15 years. So there's no comparison. Part of it is a sort of cultural longing. And of course, that whole picture now has been messed up by the polarization. I mean, the answer the question you've got to ask when talking about the relationship with the United States is which United States? Is it a second-term Trump United States, or is it a first-term Biden United States? And that matters now, even though some people in the United Kingdom might be slightly sort of embarrassed to say it out loud. Trump would suit this government in the sense that he is possibly more likely to prioritize doing a trade deal with us than Biden is. I think Biden will look to restore links and relations with the European Union. The UK will no longer be such a priority. He's certainly no fan of Brexit. So I have to say, over the course of the last decade, decade and a half, since the Iraq War, the special relationship hasn't been as central to British political discourse as it was before then. I remember David Cameron and George Osborne distancing the UK a little bit from the United States in their rhetoric in opposition. We had the vote over Syria under David Cameron, which had a massive impact on thinking in Washington. So I think, people still are nostalgic about it. And of course, one of the things many Brexiters are is sort of chronically nostalgic. So that's still there, but it's a far less central part of British political discourse, I think, now than it used to be.
And I think what was interesting about the US relationship from a Brussels perspective was that just how clearly, it was perceived in Brussels that the British were maybe outplayed on Capitol Hill by the Irish when it came to the Good Friday Agreement and issues regarding, the Northern Ireland Protocol. And I think what is interesting is that although the US-UK special relationship was long touted as a kind of special prize of Brexit, that the reality is slightly more nuanced.
There was nothing new in the statements we heard from Capitol Hill from Democrats about the importance of the Good Friday Agreement and the fact that their approval of any trade deal with the United Kingdom will hinge on the Irish situation being properly addressed. I think we'd heard that over the past 2 or 3 years anyway. I think what was the PR coup for the Irish in Washington was getting Joe Biden to say it, or to say something approaching it, which I think is what gave it the prominence that it enjoyed in the press.
Yeah, well, I think perhaps the only new element of the whole episode, apart from the Biden support, was the fact that the hysterical reaction from a couple of Tory party backbenchers, which I thought was interesting and probably says something about the pressures that are building in the backbenches. But that leads me on.
We saw that before. I mean, remember, we saw that before when President Obama intervened in the referendum campaign. Conservative MPs aren't necessarily averse to criticising even sitting US presidents, let alone presidential candidates. True.
Yeah, very true. Garvin, that brings me back. I've got two further questions in on Twitter. One for Garvin, one for the professor. Garvin, it's a very simple question. It's that how long will it take for Anglo-Irish political relations to recover in the aftermath of the publication of the Internal Market Bill?
Well, Anglo-Irish relations have been around for a very long time. And in practice, the commercial ties and the geographic ties between the two countries and even the cultural ties are very, very strong. It has the busiest air bridge in normal times when planes actually fly between any two countries, I think, in the world, but certainly in Europe. They are each other's I think if you take single nations, I think they are actually each other's largest trading partner. It might be the case the United States is a larger one for Ireland, but I'm not sure. But so much of British trade actually goes to Ireland, but simply because of geographic proximity and the use of the English language. It's even though there was a lot of political grandstanding, it's not necessarily going to turn into anything that substantive, unless either in the UK the government does something crazy, which cannot always be ruled out, and in Ireland if a subsequent election leads to a Sinn Féin-led administration in Dublin. Both of those things could lead to permanent deterioration of relations between the two. I would say that a lot of them relations will continue practically carrying on much as they always did. There'll be political spats, but as long as there isn't active attempts to undermine things from London, and there isn't a Sinn Féin led administration in Dublin, things should more or less carry on.
Okay, thank you. Professor, another question in on Twitter specifically for you. It asked me, could I ask the professor if he thinks that in light of the coronavirus, all the economic and social costs, whether the British government should continue with their plans for HS2 and high-speed rail linking London to Birmingham, Manchester and beyond?
Well, I mean, in a sense, that's slightly sort of above my pay grade, in the sense that who the hell knows what state the public finances will be in and what our priorities will be this time next year. What I would say about HS2 is it was an example of the worst political marketing you've ever seen. The point of HS2 isn't the S, it isn't speed. Even though the headlines were about knocking 15 minutes off your journey time from London to Birmingham, or 20 minutes off your journey time to London to Manchester, that really wasn't the point. And if that was the point, then we should scrap it immediately because it'd be a waste of money. The point of HS2 was always capacity. That is to say, to build a new train line to south, going through the Midlands, through, should be said, a lot of those seats that Boris Johnson won for the Conservatives for the first time ever, or the first time in a long time, and thereby increase capacity on Britain's railways, which means you're less likely to get delays on the other lines, where delays quite often happen because fast trains were trapped behind slow trains. So in that sense, as an infrastructure project, it has a perfectly good rationale in terms of building capacity. Whether or not we should or we shouldn't go ahead and do it in what is going to be a dramatically altered set of fiscal circumstances, I don't know, because I don't know what those circumstances will look like. I certainly think that the government cannot afford to return to what the Conservative government did post-2020, which is a policy of austerity. I think government will need to keep spending and need to keep investing and need to keep taking advantage of historically low interest rates to keep the economy going. But whether when we come out of the pandemic, that is the top of our list of priorities rather than issues that flow more directly from the pandemic, I don't know.
And just
I just wanted to
go ahead.
Come in actually on British infrastructure spending, because High Speed 2 in many ways is one of its smaller infrastructure problems. Far more serious is what's happening in the power generation sector, where I think Hitachi has just pulled out of one new nuclear power upgrade. Another one is being carried out with significant Chinese involvement. That's becoming more and more problematic as the politics of China gets more and more difficult because of Huawei, because of the genocide against the Uyghurs, and because of Hong Kong. So it's in a sense, if they have to cut something, High Speed 2 is easier to cut because the lights will still stay on even if High Speed 2 is out. But there's a serious crunch when it comes to power generation and electricity capacity coming, because they went for these very expensive nuclear power stations that seem to be very, very difficult to build. They require an awful lot of external investment. And even in order to get EDF to commit to the French, this is the French nuclear power operator, to commit to helping build one that the Chinese are also involved in, they had to agree to pay EDF a very high price for that electricity for the foreseeable future. because of changes in the energy market, the collapse in the oil price, the cheapening of offshore wind and solar, that's looking increasingly like a bad deal. So they're going to have serious questions to organize their electricity supply before they even think about transport infrastructure.
And just a kind of a follow-on question on the infrastructure, last one. Has coronavirus kind of put the nail in the coffin of the privatisation of rail and the rail franchise system as we know it? Because what strikes me in Brussels is that Britain is often referred to as, a shining light in terms of, introducing a more competitive, privatised, train system. But then I say, okay, but maybe you should go and use the trains in the UK, and maybe you might have a different view. But I'm just wondering, they're already having to make all these emergency payments to the franchisee, most of which are continental European companies, at least partially. So I'm just wondering how the Conservative Party, this government, would play that.
Yeah. I mean, the problem with the rail franchising in the end, I think, came down to the Treasury because they drove too hard a bargain on the bids for the franchises. So companies were very greedy to get their hands on what they thought would be lucrative contracts, whether the South West Rail, the West Coast Main Line, the East Coast Main Line that never seemed to make any money for anybody. And as it was found, they couldn't actually run the service profitably and at a standard that people wanted to use once they had the franchise. They gave them up or they were bailed out. The case is different for London commuter franchises, which were very profitable. But so profitable, the Treasury, when they were relet, the Treasury started increasing the price for them so it could subsidise the North. And the rail industry essentially operates on this sort of Italian Christian Democrat model I talked about earlier, where you have hugely expensive rail services in the South that are profitable for the Treasury and also profitable for the operators. And the extra money, particularly from the Treasury, is then used to subsidise rail in the North or in, I think, in Scotland as well, and the Midlands. That situation has stopped working because it's actually been too mean to the private sector. They privatise it and then they nationalise the profits from the privatisation, and that doesn't work. I mean, the lesson is that if you're going to privatise something, it needs to be commercially viable to operate. Otherwise, you end up fleecing one half and subsidising the other half of the system. They're going to have to think about something else. I don't think they'll go back to the original purist model, which is to have a system that was modeled on air travel, where you would bid for slots at train stations.
Yeah.
And at least that's probably viable for long-term, long-run intercity kind of trains, but it doesn't work for commuter services. I'm not sure they're really thinking this through, just because they don't have very much capacity. They can't even think through their track and trace system. I suspect they'll probably just operate them and have a nationalisation essentially by stealth.
But actually, your answer to that question then brings me on. I need to ask one more question, and I have 2 or 3 more questions from people watching. Do you think that Brexit and everything that's happened since the referendum result in 2016, do you think that that's causing, perhaps Brussels, people around Europe to actually overlook some of the strengths, some of the underlying strengths of the British economy, which will, continue to remain very important, no matter what the scale of Brexit that occurs. I'm talking about, the financial services, fintech, City of London, etc.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, Professor, do you think that there is a chance that, a lot in Brussels, because of what's happened, are overly pessimistic about the prospects of Britain prospering outside of Europe? Because, of course, if Britain prospers, that, of course, brings a whole new set of conflicts for the European Union.
I mean, it would be nice to think of any European country prospering in the wake of COVID. I think we're all going to face economic problems. I mean, it seems to me that serious economists are agreed that no one in the business of thinking about the Brexit impact is forecasting what British economy. What people are doing is forecasting what the impact on that economy will be of Brexit. And there seems to be very little doubt that in the short to medium term, at a minimum, those impacts will be negative. That is to say that the British economy will grow less quickly than it would have done had it remained within the Customs Union. That means it won't grow. Growth would have been bigger. Now, what happens in the British economy is going to depend on a mixture of, what the government does, what the global economic situation looks like, and so on. The British economy isn't suddenly going to collapse. I mean, this is one of the problems with the way the Brexit debate was carried out. It was often made to sound as if, if we leave the European Union, things will stop. The British economy will keep going, but it will keep going facing quite a significant amount of churn, the need for recalibration. Our trading patterns are going to have to change. The trade we have with the European Union will decrease significantly in quantity, even with a deal. It's worth stressing that whilst everyone talks about this difference between deal and no deal, even the kind of deal that Boris Johnson is seeking with the European Union is going to have a massive impact on trade between the UK and the EU. It will still involve considerable delays at borders, and even if tariffs have gone, that will impact on the ease with which people trade between the UK and the EU. But yeah, I don't think, this isn't an apocalyptic scenario, but it's a scenario where there will be damage done to the UK economy. And for some companies that are trading a lot with the European Union and maybe can't find alternative markets, it's going to be very, very difficult indeed.
And one final kind of comment or question from my side is, I came across this quote from Professor Menyon's book with Professor Evans in 2017, and I think it was in the conclusion where you wrote that, I wrote it down so I wouldn't misquote you, that globalization, open markets and European integration do not churn out enough winners to build stable electoral coalitions. So I was just wondering, if you take the situation, if you throw the coronavirus and its terrible economic and social impacts on top of that, I was just wondering, we kind of alluded to it earlier indirectly, but are we now looking not just in Britain maybe is perhaps the most obvious example at the moment, but it's definitely evident in other European countries, that we're looking at a political system that is no longer left-right in the traditional sense, but maybe it's going to be more defined by urban-rural, by, geographical location, by age, by level of education. Do we think that kind of divisions in society are here to stay, and how it's reflected in the political system?
I mean, politics is changing. There's no doubt about that. And the way politics is changing is different across different countries. I mean, if you look at France, for instance, a relatively significant number of young people voted Front National, more than the sort of British way of looking at things, that the young are progressive and liberal and open, and the older are far less so. So it varies. It varies by the structures of politics in each country. There's far less centre periphery tension in a very decentralised country with strong regional cities like Germany than there is in a country like the UK or even a country like France. So it varies. But politics is definitely changing. I would distinguish COVID from the other things you mentioned, or that we mentioned, globalization, European integration, because certainly some of the survey work we've done shows that the public recognise that this is a crisis out of the blue, imposed on government through no fault of their own, rather than, and I think in that sense it's viewed right difficult. I mean, we did some recent work in focus groups on trust in governments, and one of the things that came out really clearly about that was everyone, Leaver, Remainer, left, right, wants the government to do well. They want them to tackle this. They want them to find the ways to do it. They want to be able to believe in their government. I think in that sense, the political reverberations of COVID will be different to the political reverberations, say, of globalization, where there were many people who came to feel that this was an economic model freely chosen by governments that privileged some at the expense of others. This, I think, is different, though ultimately, of course, as I said before, some of that thinking might reappear when it comes to who's getting the bill to pay for the fiscal deficits we've got to face in the future. Where that burden falls is going to be one of the fundamental defining features of politics over the next decade.
Garvin, do you just want to make a comment, or else I'll just move on to the last?
Yeah. So just on this particular issue, the one thing that seems to be stable across almost everywhere, Western and Eastern Europe and Northern and Southern Europe, the United States, at least across the West, is a division between based on levels of education. Insofar as an effect based on age, it looks like it's a secondary effect based on education. And across all societies, people with greater levels of education are more likely to identify with the open side of these divides and less likely to identify with the more national side of these divides. That seems to be true. That's true in Hungary. It's true in Poland. It's true in France. The Front National younger vote is by and large a lower middle class sort of technically educated or less educated vote. It's also, of course, because of the nationalist nature of these things, it's also correlated with whiteness. The ethnic minority urban uneducated populations tend to have stuck with left-wing parties for sort of obvious cultural reasons. There hasn't been one that has been able to, somehow be. I mean, Nick Timothy, Theresa May's chief of staff, did try this. He had this sort of civic xenophobia, where he said, "Well, if you're black and a British citizen, we will protect you, basically at the expense of more recent Polish immigrants." But that argument didn't really kind of work, because he said, "But you're black and a British citizen, so we'll treat you as someone on our side. But someone who looks exactly like you, who happens to come from somewhere else, we'll be hostile to." So it didn't really catch on as an electoral coalition.
Okay, Garvin, we've got about 3 or 4 minutes left. Let me just count them up. 1, 2, 3. I've got seven questions of the same variant.
Okay, rapid fire mode.
It's the same variant, and the question I think we've been very successful in not talking about it, so I think we can devote 3 or 4 minutes at the end, is, in the opinion of the speakers, will we have a deal or a no deal by the end of 2020? Professor, if you want to go first.
Are we on to one-word answers now, in which case I'll say deal.
Deal, okay. And could you elaborate in 60 seconds?
Well, I would say it's 50-50 either way, but what prompts me still to think there will be a deal is the simple fact that both sides would far prefer a deal to no deal.
Okay. And you think that will override everything else?
As I said, I think the numbers are close to 50-50, but in the interest of speed, I was trying to choose, and I suppose on balance, I just...
Okay, perfect. Garvin, what's your opinion?
The two alternatives we have are both what was considered at the time to be, at time of the referendum, to be no deal. Either we'll have facilitating arrangements on air travel, recognition of citizens' rights, practical things that will be, and tariffs, or we will have a chaos deal. So what we're now calling a deal is so much thinner and so much less than what used to be, and the case that we can call a deal if we want, but really we're talking about no deal. If you want to put me on the spot, I will say there will be tariffs come the 1st of January. Okay,
and a very last kind of question or a comment. I was struck recently because I was talking to somebody working in what used to be the UK Perm Rep, is now the UK mission to the European Union. And they were telling me that their staffing numbers have between tripled and quadrupled. So I'm just wondering, in a strange sort of way, will actually Brexit bring about a more, how would I say, kind of a bigger British engagement with what's happening in Brussels?
Well, it won't be a bigger British engagement, in the sense that if you really want to be engaged, you're in the room. However, what we're realizing is it takes far more resource to try and influence things if you're not in the room, because you're going to have more people standing at more doors with a glass to that door trying to hear what's going on inside. And that's quite that requires quite a lot of manpower.
Yeah. Okay, well, we're just on 4 o'clock Brussels time exactly. So at this point, I want to thank everybody who watched online, everybody who asked questions. I think I would like especially to thank our 2 speakers, Professor Garvin, I know you've got busy schedules. It's Brexit these days. So thank you very much for joining. We appreciate it. And hopefully we might all be able to visit London and Brussels or vice versa in person in 2021.
Yeah,
so
thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.